Hello and welcome to South Fork Sea Farmers. Today's episode is on the purpose and practice of shellfish regulation. I am environmental journalist Alexandra Talty, and I'm here with Tim Treadwell, Commanding Officer of East Hampton Marine Patrol. So the last time I saw you, Tim, I was in a rescue jet ski course and you were teaching boating safety. So I know you spend a lot of time on the water in classrooms all over the East End promoting water safety and shellfish regulation. Could you share a little bit about your role as commanding officer and senior harbor master?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. So the East Hampton Marine Patrol is tasked with enforcing both town code ordinances and New York State nav law regulations pertaining to our waterways. So, we enforce all town code regulations related to shellfish, as well as beach driving, beach fires, and then on the New York State navigation law side, speed in the harbor, boating safety, like you mentioned, personal watercraft regulation, what sort of permits, what sort of certifications you have to have, stuff like that. We also have as well as a law enforcement role, much like the Coast Guard. We also have a search and rescue role where we'll be dispatched to water emergencies by boats that are disabled, either inside the harbors or outside of the harbors. We also work with East Hampton Volunteer Ocean Rescue on cases of swimmers in distress at unprotected beaches. We've had, unfortunately, too many of those lately. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
And what could you walk us through a typical day if there is one?
A typical day of mine.
Yes.
So a typical day of mine might be slightly different than your average harbor master because I have more administrative duties. But I mean, basically, I sign onto the radio so that I can be dispatched by the police department like any harbor master. Generally I'll go through my emails and catch up on any of that. Figure out what the weather's doing, what the tides are doing, so I can sort of make a plan and manage my staff as to what their sector assignments are going to be. Generally we try to have a harbor master in the east and a harbor master in the west, and then we try to have at least one boat out that has two harbor masters on it. So we have either we have a large and a small boat in both 3 Mile Harbor and Montauk Harbor at the Coast Guard station, and our boats in 3 Mile Harbor are at Gann Road, right next to the Shellfish Hatchery, in fact.
Oh, great. So it sounds
Yes.
like a lot of kind of making sure things are prepared and ready, and then also, dealing with the weather and the seas and what's going on with
Correct,
that.
correct. And so as far as my day goes, then I will, make sure, everybody has their direction for the day, make sure everything's going smoothly. I often have meetings where I interact with town board, the chief of police. That's sort of at least on a weekly basis. We get together, discuss what's going on. So all the different departments are working together between code enforcement and the town attorney and the building department and the planning department. So most harbor masters don't actually have to get involved with that. They're more focused on patrolling certain areas. So if I'm not doing administrative duties, I also go out on patrol. So we'll go around and we'll check shellfish areas where people would normally shellfish and places that they're not supposed to shellfish, and make sure people that are shellfishing have permits, and that they're shellfishing in certified areas where they're allowed to take shellfish. We spend a fair amount of our patrol time checking shellfish spots. Some of us joke and refer to ourselves as clam cops, in fact, because we spend a lot of our time, doing law enforcement on shellfish. And we actually do quite amount. If I may brag from my
Yes, I
thing,
love.
I can tell you some stats here. So in 2020, we checked a total of 325 shellfish permits.
Wow.
We checked, we did 1,503 activity checks, meaning that if we went to a shellfish area to check it, but there was no one shellfishing, we still keep track that we checked that area. And then we actually wrote 66 shellfish violations, 66 summonses for people either not having a shellfish permit, taking undersized or over limit shellfish, or shellfishing in an uncertified area.
And I've always wondered, because sometimes when I'm going clamming or just going to the beach myself, I see Marine Patrol stopping people. What is most of the is it people shellfishing in uncertified areas, not having licenses? Like what's the percentage
I
of
would
those
say
violations?
it's mostly no shellfish permit. Unfortunately, there's some sort of social media thing going on where people from out of town learn via social media that they can say get crabs out of Georgica Pond. So people from out of town, a lot of people from the five boroughs even come out in the middle of the night and take crabs out of Georgica Pond, and we've had people poaching also in Nat Peak Harbor in the middle of the night. People that aren't from here that aren't eligible for a shellfish permit come out and do that. So I mean, there was maybe a dozen people one night at 2 o'clock in the morning. I came out on a call out, and there were about a dozen people poaching with lights on and baskets in the middle of Nat Peak Harbor. And then we got there, they all scattered, and we were sort of chasing them around in the dark. And some of them were hanging out in the harbor so that we couldn't get to them without putting on a wetsuit. I actually did get to a couple people's baskets in my waders, but anyway, so most of the tickets or most of the summonses issued are for no shellfish permit. Then the other ones, I would say the second most would be undersized, and then over limit, meaning more than you can take, and then uncertified. We don't get too much uncertified. So I mean, you have two different types of shellfishers. You have your commercial guys and your recreational guys. The commercial guys really would never be in an uncertified area because they are selling that. That's the whole point, right? Sometimes if you go to an uncertified area though, as a recreational person, and you don't know it, you're going to find a lot of shellfish there, perhaps because nobody's taking it because it's an uncertified area. But you don't want to eat that shellfish. That's the whole point. Uncertified areas are generally places where the water movement isn't sufficient to cleanse, to cleanse the water, so that the shellfish in there are not poisoned.
And what is the easiest way for an average East End resident to check where waters are certified?
That is an excellent question. So when you go to the town clerk's office to get your shellfish permit, which you have to have, and you have to prove your residency, right? They'll give you two very important things. One is a shellfish gauge, which looks like this.
Okay.
Right? So you get your shellfish gauge. Then with this, if your clam falls through here, it's too small.
Oh.
Right, and then you take your oyster, right, and you measure your oyster with this, right. So that's a required piece of equipment, and they will give you that. They might charge you, I think, $3 actually, but then they'll also give you this very important booklet here called the East Hampton Shellfish. And so in here, when you open this up, it'll show you a map. I don't know how well this picks up, but you can see these areas here.
Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, there you go.
Where like this.
Perfect.
Like
yeah.
these are uncertified. See, uncertified. So you need to know this information, not just for the law, but for your own safety, even more importantly, because you don't want to be eating shellfish out of these uncertified areas.
Yeah, and so that's really cool, the gauge. I have my shellfishing permit in Southampton, but I don't think they give us the clam gauge.
How do they expect you to measure
I
your
don't know.
shellfish in Southampton?
I don't know. This is the beginning of a shellfish scandal.
So you could measure your shellfish with a tape measure, but in our town, actually, you're required to have a gauge. So if I found somebody shellfishing without a permit, and I wanted to be a mean harbor master, I could also write them for not having a gauge, because that's also required. But generally, they would just get a ticket for no shellfish permit.
And what are, I think out here, shellfishing is such a part of our traditions. That's how the indigenous people fed themselves. That's how the early settlers fed themselves. Clamming is a family pastime of mine. Can you share a little bit about why we need the permits and how that helps protect our waterways and ourselves?
Absolutely. There's a number, there's a number of very good reasons why the permitting is important. Number one, regulating it to only town residents limits the amount of pressure on on the fishery, on the shell fishery. Because obviously, if that wasn't the case, our shellfish stocks would be depleted much quicker than they could be with only residents only. The size limits obviously allow the shellfish to mature, and that's particularly important, when it comes to scallops, which are, a very highly sought after commodity in the shellfish world. And unfortunately, because of different water quality issues, or not really water quality issues, but algae issues and stuff like that, the scallops have not, the scallop crop has not yielded what it used to, particularly back in the old days, like you're talking about, which is very unfortunate. So all of these, all of it is interrelated. So if you're depleting one stock, it's going to have an effect on a different stock. And if the eelgrass, for instance, if there's a problem with the water quality and the eelgrass, which is a natural habitat for many types of shellfish, is being depleted, that's also going to have a negative impact on the overall stock.
And how did you guys come up with the sizes for clams and oysters?
Wow, that's a good question. I can't actually answer that. That's a little out of my pay grade, I suppose. Those were the sizes when no, but I can answer that a little better than that. The New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, who regulates sizes for fish and shellfish. We basically, we don't, inside the town, our regulations can be more stringent, but not less. So certainly that would be the starting point where the trustees would make those regulations, because we are talking about pretty much exclusively where these shellfish are coming from, trustee bottomland, except for Lake Montauk. But you're still required to have a shellfish permit to take shellfish out of Lake Montauk.
And that's actually one thing that I think is really interesting about out here, and as well as your job, is the interplay between the trustees, the state. Is that ever difficult, kind of managing that? It's a very unique jurisdiction that we have.
Yes, I think that as far as we're concerned, or I'm concerned, in the Marine Patrol, it hasn't become very difficult, or over the years it's become less difficult, because we're all working together fairly effectively. I think it's confusing to the general public often. I get a lot of calls, say people want a mooring permit, right? They ask if because if it's in Lake Montauk, then I have to send them to the clerk's office because they need a town mooring permit. If it's in one of the harbors, or it's in 3 Mile Harbor, Accabonac, or Napeague, they then need a trustee permit, so they have to go to the trustee's office. So that does confuse the general public, but we have a very good, or I like to think I have a very good working relationship with the trustees, as well as the DEC. We often work together with the DEC on different fisheries enforcement, including shellfish. The DEC will come out here when scallops open, and help us out. They generally don't have a lot of staff out here on the East End, or a lot of officers. They do have officers assigned to the East End, but in general, they don't have enough staff to really enforce all the regulations that they regulate, that need to be enforced. Whereas that's where we have to come in and assist with that.
And so they rely on you guys for some of that day to day.
Correct. They handle, thankfully for us, a lot of the commercial sector, like all the they involve themselves much more with the commercial fishermen in Montauk and the party boats than the recreational fishermen.
And so I have a little bit of the town code about the regulation of shellfish. I'm just going to read it, and I'd love to hear kind of how that relates to your job. So, under waters in the town of East Hampton, in order to ensure the propagation of shellfish, to protect the public health and welfare, to promote the economic well-being of those who rely upon town waters for their livelihoods and to provide food and recreation for the town of East Hampton.
Yes. So that is why it's so important. All of those reasons. From a law enforcement and a regulatory standpoint, that's sort of just a small part of the big picture. Whereas what you read there is the big picture, right? We want to continue to be able to, for generations, be able to shellfish in our waters and to pass that on to other generations. And as you know, or as it's becoming more and more clear, it's very hard. The Bayman way of life is disappearing or has been disappearing for some time. I was actually fortunate to be a member of the Bayman's Dory Rescue Squad before they disbanded.
Oh, wow.
That was prior to East Ham Volunteer Ocean Rescue forming, and they were all a very solid group of men who developed very unique skills to be able to launch a dory into the surf to make a rescue. It's a lot easier to make a rescue on a PWC, as you now know, since you were in the PWC for rescue class. The dory is a completely different animal.
I know.
I digress. Sorry.
No, I've only seen photos of that, and it must have been really cool.
It was, and I'm honored to have been able to get to know some of those men and be on a dory with them. I mean, the bottom line is you really have to know what your entry point is and time it right, and then coming in, you kind of just have to, try to follow the back of a breaking wave with the prayer, because unlike a PWC, as you know, when you're coming to the beach, if you follow, the PWC has enough power to stay right behind that breaking wave,
Yeah.
and then you can hit the beach. The dory doesn't have that much power. So when that wave gets underneath you, it could flip you. If you get sideways in the swell, that's a real problem. So the Bayman had serious skills that they had honed for years, generation to generation, of being able to launch dories into the surf.
And is it ever difficult, thinking of the part that I just read, is it ever difficult kind of balancing the recreation with the commercial, with also people that are not necessarily interested in shellfishing at all, just beachgoers or?
Yes, I mean, I think that generally everyone that plays by the rules, commercially and recreational, everybody gets along. But often one of the biggest challenges is if, say, you have somebody, a commercial individual who doesn't follow the rules, then it's very difficult for the other commercial fishermen to say, well, okay, he's putting, he's making more money because he's breaking the rules. Maybe I need to break the rules too, because it's not fair that he's making more money, right? Luckily, as far as I know, or I like to think, we don't have too many problems with that in this town. It's a very, from an enforcement standpoint, it's not an easy thing to enforce. We can't be everywhere every time a commercial shellfish harvester comes to the dock, and we can't check their catch every time. I mean, it's just not possible. We can't be at every beach where people are clamming and check them all the time. So at least on the recreational side, it's very helpful when the public is aware of sort of what's going on, and will let us know if they see people, say shellfishing that don't appear like they should be shellfishing. Same with fish. I mean, one of the things I hate the most is I check a spot, say, and there's a fisherman there, and he says, "Oh, you should have been here an hour ago. There was 100 guys taking short fish," right? And so that's one of the things I hate to hear the most, because I want to say to that individual, well, why didn't you make a phone call, right? If you see that and you call 537-7575, right? They will dispatch a Marine Patrol officer or a police officer if nobody's available to that.
So is that the best, if you see someone taking fish that are too small
or shellfish or one of the ways it's sort of easy to identify, not always, but when you see people sort of wading around in the water and toe clamming, right? That's usually a sign that it's possible that person doesn't have a license. It's not always true.
Really?
I guess that's a little bit of a sweeping generalization, but most of the people that are permit holders, have some sort of tool, a rake and a basket. And they're not putting them in their pockets. They're not loading up their pockets with the shellfish.
Oh, interesting. I've
Yes.
never. And what about, you mentioned earlier that you guys recently had a night, you were called at night to a nearby body of water. How would someone, if I were driving by or something, how would I notice that? Is that even possible?
Well, that's a very good question. So we actually we had gotten a tip that night. We'd actually had some officers on late, and we were doing surveillance on that body of water. But it was sort of a random thing where these individuals would show up at different times, and so it always seems like Murphy's Law when you put the officers out there, then the crime doesn't happen. It just seems like that seems to be the case a lot. But in this case, we'd gotten a tip, that from someone who thought it looked suspicious that there were all these lights out in the middle, lights moving around out in the middle of the harbor, and people, towing floating baskets, which is what the case was in that situation.
Because in New York, you're not allowed. I know in other places you can like spearfish at night or like use, but that's not allowed in New York.
Correct. You cannot, except for blue claw crab. Excuse me, blue claw crabs. You can take them at night.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
so nothing else at night.
Yes, you can't take other shellfish at night.
And so there's several shellfish predators that are listed in the shellfish ordinance. Are all of them native species?
I can't answer that question. I'm sorry. I would imagine that they are, but I've done no research towards that. So I do not. I would imagine that they are because I've never seen that change. I've never heard of a shellfish predator, foreign species being introduced into our waters.
Okay, and then I guess can you share a bit about starfish being returned to town waters? Has that changed over the years?
No, that's the same. That's very rare. We very rarely run into any issues with the shellfish predators, really. That night I was referring to, in Napeek Harbor with the headlamps in the water, those individuals were pretty much just pillaging the bottom. There was anything they could find. So they had little conchs. If there were starfish, maybe they would have taken those. There was actually some spider crabs, some undersized scallops. There was some clams, some oysters, but they pretty much were just taking whatever they could with no regard for any type of size, species, or regulation.
Wow, and do you guys monitor social media now to kind of keep abreast of these?
We try to, but I don't often know how to access these other sites, and some of them are in different languages too, which obviously was also be a hurdle.
Yeah, and so, we mentioned earlier about eelgrass and, the loss of eelgrass. How does that, it's like one of the most important habitats in our coastal waters. And, I remember when I used to go fishing with my family, we used to have eelgrass all around where my grandma lived. And now when I go there, it's like just a tiny little strip. What can average citizens do to promote eelgrass restoration? And then what is the work that you do?
Well, I think the average citizen, the most important thing to promote the health of all of our waterways is just to not pollute them in any way. I mean, particularly from our standpoint, one of the worst issues we have as people, or one of the things that we're really in tune to, is people not pumping out their boats at the pump out station and pumping their boats out into the harbors, which they're of course not allowed to do. We don't find too much of that, but all of our harbors are no discharge zones, and both harbors have a free pump out service, so there's no excuse for it. And it obviously would have a negative impact not only on our shellfish but also on the waterway in general, and also any other type of pollutants that come from people's lawns that drain in there. So the best thing the public can do is really just try to be as clean and as environmentally friendly as they can, particularly if they live near the water or recreate on the water.
I know I've heard on this show in particular, we've talked before about, if you are lucky enough to live on the water, having a 5-foot barrier of native species, not hardened surfaces.
Yes. And if you're lucky enough to live near the water, you're lucky enough is the other thing.
Yeah.
That, right? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and um, I think that as far as the eelgrass goes too, I'm not really sure. I think they haven't really been able to successfully regrow eelgrass, and I'm really, Barley would be a better person, in charge of the Shellfish Hatchery to talk to you about this than I am. Not being as in tune to the environmental science side of it, but there's a lot of different things that have impact on the eelgrass. One arguably is a lot of people believe that the dredging for scallops has a negative effect on the eelgrass, but that's also been a tradition, right, of dredging, scraping the bottom with dredges to get scallops. So, some people claim it doesn't have a negative effect on the eelgrass. Some people say that it does. I'm not absolutely certain.
Is that, do you often have to kind of weigh what might be like a tradition? And, a lot of times when I talk to other people in this marine environmental world, 30 years ago, maybe the eelgrass could handle dredging for scallops. But now, the waters are warmer. There's less of eelgrass. Like, there's a lot of factors that are kind of combining, at least when I speak to marine biologists and hear about this. Are there many rules or things that have changed that are kind of impacting traditions of the area?
I think yes. I think that's really what that the trustees have to decide. That really, I guess, on whether or not that's having such a negative impact that it needs to be regulated more, or whether or whether it's having a minimal impact. That is something I really think that the trustees would have to decide upon, since it's their bottom land in general. I think that one really nice thing that the trustees in the town did, really the trustees did it, was it used to be that the scallop opener would be on a Monday, and then it would be and then the commercial guys would also go in. Most of the commercial guys use dredges, so they would go in and they would dredge the bottom while people were with their look boxes trying to get scallops, and it would become a big muddy mess depending on what the tide was doing. So what's very nice now is dredging is prohibited on Sundays. That's an old tradition that's been in the books, by my understanding, for a very long time. So now scallops recreationally opens on Sunday. So you don't have to fight, against the dredges.
And so I have also some of East Hampton Town Code about scallops may be taken with a dredge or scrape, having an opening at the mouth not to exceed 36 inches in width. Are there other acceptable tools for scallops?
Absolutely. I mean, most people that aren't on a boat dragging a dredge, because you need a boat to tow the dredge, are actually using a look box. So it's a box that has glass inside, and then they basically just have a little net because the scallop is on the surface. So they go around and then they scoop it up with the net, and then if it's large enough, they then keep it. And then the other method, which is one of my favorite methods, is if you and this might be one of your favorite methods too, being that you're a swimmer, is you can snorkel around, right, and you can see the scallop. And then if you have a little net, and you carry a little bag with you, and you can snorkel around and take scallops that way, which I think is a very fun way to go scalloping.
I've actually never gone scalloping, but I feel like every year that I'm here at the time, it always seems to be a bad scallop year. So
Darn.
maybe this year will be.
Darn. I mean, there's been a few years where we've been out there, and that's sort of one of the busiest days of our year. So any Marine Patrol officer available is working. It's because we have to have people at every harbor, checking, but making sure people don't start scalloping before sunrise and keep scalloping after sunset, and that the recreational people are not taking more than 1 bushel, and the commercial people aren't taking more than 5. And that they're real bushels, they're not overheaping bushels, that they're in, technically they're supposed to be in trustee branded bushel bags to regulate the amount. But then, other years there's been so few that's never really, people taking over limit hasn't really been an issue because they couldn't really get their limits.
what are you thinking for this year?
I can't answer that. You're right. You asked some very tough questions out. I feel like I didn't do my homework before. I didn't know really I should have researched starfish and no. But so yeah, that's usually something that a little closer to the season. What happens is other baymen will be clamming, oystering. They'll see the oysters, they'll see how it looks, or barley, the shellfish hatchery. They'll be out and they'll be seeing sort of what's going on, and that's how we generally get a prediction prior to the season. Sometimes people do what we call surveying, which is frustrating to us from an enforcement detail because people will go out with their look boxes and they'll look around to see where their scallops are so that on opening day they can go to that spot. But to us, it looks like they're scalloping before the season opens, right? So honestly, I'm anti-surveying. I wish it was unlawful to do that because it's hard for us to tell whether that person, right, with the look box is actually taking any scallops.
Oh, interesting. It's like, it sounds like it's almost like a treasure hunt. Like no one can start before everyone
Correct.
can start.
Correct.
And so between like clams, oysters, and scallops, it sounds like scallops take the most kind of time.
Yes, well, they're the most sought after. They're sometimes they're referred to as Bonnet gold, right? Because they're and I certainly enjoy a meal of scallops as much as anything. They are delicious. The local bay scallop. I mean, a sea scallop can't touch our local bay scallop as far as I'm concerned, as far as taste. But because they're so rare, that also drives the price high, right? So in some ways, at least for the bayman's sake, my understanding is that in some years where it's lean, at least they're getting very good money for what limited scallops they're selling. Versus years where there's so many scallops, the price goes down because there's so many scallops on the market that the price goes down. I mean, I've seen the price be from less than $10 a pound to now, like I think last year it might have been some people were looking for $40 a pound. Yeah. So there's a big difference there.
They are really good, I have to say. It's definitely, and I love at that time of year when you drive around and you can just see like signs like scallops here. Then you get like the
local
call.
Scallops. Yep.
So how are the year-round and seasonal closure areas determined?
They are determined by the DEC. They have a water testing unit that tests the water and decides, whether or not it should be certified or uncertified. I'm not exactly sure of the scientific methods, all of them that they use to decide that, but in general, it has a lot to do with water flow. Like the areas, if you look on the shellfish map in the book, the areas that you see that are closed or uncertified or seasonally uncertified are almost all areas where there's not a lot of water movement. Like they're either inside a cove or they're at, say, in 3 Mile Harbor, the head of the harbor area, way up where there's very little movement, where it doesn't get flushed. Mostly areas that are getting flushed regularly by tide, those are the certified areas.
And will you ever see certain things happen? I know in Southampton sometimes when it rains, like parts of North Sea Harbor will be closed.
Yes.
So do you guys report that to the DEC?
Yes.
Then?
Yes. The DEC actually regulates that. If there's a certain amount of rainfall, over a certain amount of inches of rainfall, then they shut the area down for a certain period of time. All harbors will become, there won't be any shellfishing at all, even in certified areas, for a duration of time, depending on how much rain there was. The town used to have a shellfish hotline. I'm actually not sure if that's still in existence. It used to come basically from natural resources, and so now though there's a number actually, and this is really important. There's a number on here to call the DEC hotline. There is a local number here. I'm not sure if this works, but the DEC hotline definitely works, and that has the most updated information, whereas I'm not sure if our local hotline currently does. The only downside of the DEC hotline is it goes, say, from Up Island to us, right? So it goes so you have to wait for all the, until you get there. You can also go online though, and that's obviously quicker. You could go to the DEC Shellfish site, and they have basically these same these same maps that are very nicely color coded, which will show you, and it'll give you the same.
And do
the
you,
same info.
I find as I've lived here longer as an adult, I realize how many resources we do have with all of this online as compared to other areas and stuff. Do you find that a lot of people realize that or know about it?
I don't know that enough people realize that. We have a lot of resources online. Pretty much all of our rules and regulations are online somewhere. Unfortunately, we write a lot of tickets to people that say they didn't know the rules, and really, in my opinion, the rules are very easy to find. And for a lot of the stuff that we write tickets for, say it's beach driving, beach fires, or dogs on the beach, pretty much anywhere you go, that activity is going to be regulated. So in my opinion, if you're going to engage in an activity which is commonly regulated, you would be responsible for knowing the regulations of the regulated activity. But a lot of people, just say they didn't know that they, and same with the shellfish. People say they didn't know they need a permit, right? But there's signs posted that says shellfish permit required. The trustee's done a very good job posting that. There's a sign that says you have to have a gauge. It shows a picture of the gauge. Now, these signs aren't everywhere, but they're in the most common access points. So, in my opinion, that's a little bit of a lame excuse, as they say, for not knowing the rules.
And for these licenses, in Southampton, I know you just have to bring like a proof of residency, like either your license, or is it more complicated than that? Or?
No, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
And it's free as well.
I believe there's a $15 charge for a shellfish permit. Yes. I forget what I paid because I had all mine together with my, parking pass, my shellfish permit, my dump permit, and then my beach driving permit. Yes. So you can get all that there. You can even get your in the state of New York. A lot of people also don't know, but people are catching on. You actually need what's called a marine registry card. You have to be, it's also referred to as a fishing permit. It's not really, there's no fee for it, but you have to register with the New York State DEC, and then you get a fishing permit so that you can fish. So we do enforce that too, but you can get all of that, my point is, in one stop at the clerk's office.
They're very helpful. I've actually used my fishing permit to buy beer when I haven't had my license.
Wow, really?
Yeah, because it's issued by the state, so it's like a real license.
Well, that's very interesting. I think whoever sold you beer, though, by chance.
That's illegal.
Yeah, because really, you don't have to prove. You don't need when you get that fishing permit. This is the only thing I don't like about it is you really, I could go online using a different name and a different date of birth. I'm pretty sure on the DEC's website and just make one of those, which is frustrating from a law enforcement standpoint. Because a lot of times people won't have ID, but they'll have their fishing permit.
Yeah.
But then if we run the information right from the fishing permit, it may not come back to a valid license because it's not really that person.
Oh my gosh, Tim, I thought this was a good trick I had.
I'm sorry, I hope I didn't let the cat out of the bag on TV here, but
illegally buying beer. I'm way much older
I
than
know,
that.
I know,
So.
I'm just teasing.
And then, so I know that there's a possibility of oyster reefs in Aquabonic Harbor. Specifically, the South Fork Sea Farmers are looking into this. Can you share a little bit about if this can happen, what you think that would look like, what are the benefits?
Well, I think that there's so many benefits and so few non-benefits. It basically, shellfish improves our water quality. Shellfish is a great food source. I think that where the cages would be placed in Aquabonic Harbor, they wouldn't interfere with any type of vessel traffic whatsoever. They're very unobtrusive, so I really don't see that being a problem at all. Particularly in Aquabonic Harbor, where there's not a lot of boating traffic anyways, and there's not a lot of, or there's no deep channels where people can really go into the back there. Really the only effective way to get around Aquabonic Harbor is with some sort of paddle craft. Yes.
And is that often, I know with the oyster farms that boat traffic is often a big kind of concern. Is that the same then with creating more oyster reefs if this project is successful?
Yes, but I think that luckily there's very minimal boat traffic in aquaponics, so I don't think it would have a negative impact. But your question is actually a very good question, because a lot of people don't realize this. But when we have the annual, they used to be the Boys Harbor 3 Mile Harbor fireworks. Now they're the Clamshell Foundation 3 Mile Harbor fireworks. Because there's so much boat traffic during that event, the DEC and the Marine Patrol helps enforce it. We uncertify 3 Mile Harbor until, so that's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, 4 days from the event, because there's so much vessel traffic in the harbor that could have a negative impact on the shellfish. So they wait until it gets flushed out before they reopen the harbor.
Wow, that's interesting.
So it definitely has an impact. And then the DEC is very adamant that we actively enforce the no pump out zone regulations. So that's another activity that the Marine Patrol is tasked with. So if you're operating a boat in town waters, you need to have you have a marine sanitation device, also known as an MSD, or a head on your boat. You have to have the valve set in such a way that it cannot pump overboard and be secured. So we actually, for anybody boating within our town waters, we actually have the ability to stop that vessel just to check their sanitation device to make sure that that's not happening, because that's one of the DEC's biggest fears, that if that wasn't being enforced and our waters were being polluted, they would have to uncertify our harbors, where obviously a lot of people either make their livelihood from recreate or shellfish in.
And is that specific to this area or in all of New York?
Everywhere.
Okay.
Yeah, everywhere. I mean, if you look, particularly up island, there's a lot of areas which used to be certified, which are no longer certified. That might not be from vessel traffic, though. That could also be pollution, could be blue-green algae, it could be, a number of reasons. But luckily here, we haven't had any problems with that.
That's very good. And so with these regulations, who wrote them? I know some are from the DEC, it sounds like some are from the trustees. And then how often are they reviewed, and what was the origin of these?
Good question. I would guess that when the trustees created these regulations originally, the town agreed to enforce these regulations, and that they were originally trustee regulations based on DEC regulations prior. That's a very interesting historical question that I actually would like to know, but another question that I really can't answer, when they started regulating shellfish. That's actually a very good question. That one I'm going to research after this interview, because I'm curious when that was. Did I answer your question? There was more
Definitely.
to that question.
Well, how often are these regulations
how often are they
reviewed?
changed? That's a really good question. So there's a few things in the town code. So basically, they're trustee regulations, but these regulations are in the town code. That gives us the ability to enforce them. So anything in the town code that's prohibited, you could be issued a summons for engaging in that prohibited behavior. So for instance, the regulations regarding beach driving, beach fires, dogs, all that stuff's in the town code. Mass gathering permits, people. So when all the shellfish regulations are in the town code. So if it's not in the town code, you really can't enforce it. So over the years, there's been a few things which, have sort of, like say for instance, if the town code is vague about something, then we want to make it not vague. So for instance, if it says in the town code, which it does, that any undersized shellfish shall be immediately returned to the water. So you don't want the town code to be interpretative, right? So to me, that means that you take that clam out of the water and you put it in your gauge and it falls through, you have to immediately return it. Some people, have a looser definition of that, and they will take their bushel basket to the beach and then they'll sort it on the beach, right? Which that's not immediately returned. So then when we pull up and we see that they have undersized clams, right? They say, "Oh, I was going to throw these back." But they're here on the beach. You know what I mean? So that creates a problem. So So I would actually like the code to be changed to state that, no person shall bring shellfish to the beach to cull the shellfish, right? You have to return it immediately. But again, so to answer your question, I think that it's important that the language in the town code always gets looked at, for the benefit of it not being interpretive and being black and white.
And are these regulations being translated into Spanish? And is there anything that people can do to help that effort possibly?
They should be translated in Spanish. That is an absolutely important thing. I'm actually not sure why that hasn't occurred, or if it hasn't, I'm not aware of it. I'm not sure if you go to the town code maybe online, it would be in Spanish, but that would be a really good.
I don't think in Southampton, I don't think it is.
Yeah, I don't think it is here either. I was just going to see if it's any, but it should be. It absolutely should be in Spanish as well. You should be able to get a Spanish copy of that whole book, in my opinion. It wouldn't be that hard to do. So I'm going to add that to my list of things that I want to do going forward in my job.
We're giving you
Seriously.
a lot of homework here.
No, seriously, you have it in a good way. In a good way, because really the way that I learn stuff in the job is, say like this section, or is it keeps coming up. So the way that I learn it and relearn stuff is by people asking questions that I can't answer, that I have to research, and then I find an answer, and then I learn something. So it's an excellent exercise.
And so I know your work also oversees ocean rescue, and you're a member of East Hampton Village Ocean Rescue.
East Hampton Volunteer Ocean Rescue.
I always say it wrong.
Yeah,
We say
there's a lot of
Southampton
confusion out there
Village.
between, right? There's a lot of confusion. There's some sort of pseudo ocean rescue agencies and some real ocean. So East Hampton Volunteer Ocean Rescue is dispatched by the town and the village. That's the most important thing, right? We're dispatched to water emergencies at unprotected beaches by either the village or the town. And we have a budget with the town of East Hampton and the village of East Hampton. There's other ocean rescue agencies that aren't actually dispatched, which is confusing. Or there's other ocean rescue agencies, because the term ocean rescue can be confusing because, like, say, if you're a lifeguard at a different beach, right? You could call yourself like ocean rescue because you're a lifeguard, so you're ocean rescue. So there's East Hampton Village Ocean Rescue is really the East Hampton Village Lifeguards, but it's called Ocean Rescue.
Like Main Beach, yeah.
Correct. So it's confusing, right?
Yes.
But anyways, I'm sorry. But this means a lot to me because I'm one of the founding members of East Hampton Volunteer Ocean Rescue.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
That's
Well,
very cool.
it wasn't, there was maybe 20 of us, and I was actually the first elected chief of Ocean Rescue.
Wow,
Yeah.
congrats.
Yep. So I've been involved with that for a long time.
And can you share a little bit, you mentioned, and I have read as well, there was a recent incident in Montauk, very tragic.
Yes.
Can you just share a little bit about what residents or visitors, what would be your top 5 tips or a couple tips for water safety?
Number 1, swim near a lifeguard. Swim at a protected beach near a lifeguard. Understand what the conditions of the ocean are would be number 2 on any given day. In that ditch plane situation, it was a red flag day for sure. It was an unprotected beach. It was after 6 o'clock. It was 7 o'clock, and there was a big rip current right in front of where the individuals went swimming. That would be number 1. So is to always swim near a lifeguard. Number 2 is if you're going to go for a recreational swim, and you heard some of my stories during my class, and you're going to go for a recreational swim, make sure somebody knows where you're going and when you're supposed to come back, so that you're basically giving, in what we call in the boating world, a float plan, right? So if you're a prudent mariner, what you do is you say, if I'm going to go fishing, I'm going to tell my significant other that I'm leaving at 6 and I'm going to this spot and then I'm going to this spot, so that if I don't show up, they know where to look for me. So same with as if I'm going for a swim or a stand-up paddle, very important, or a prone or a kayak or a canoe, right? Let somebody know where you're going. So that way if you don't return and there's a search and rescue case, we have a place to go to start looking for you. very important. And that's sort of unfortunately what happened. There was a drowning yesterday in Montauk, and the individual went for a swim and usually swims for 45 minutes, and he was overdue. At Ditch, that really wasn't the case. They basically, I believe, just went for a swim, and somebody got into trouble. Somebody tried to help, and then it didn't go well from there.
Yeah, it's always really tragic, I think, when these things happen out here, because we all love the water, but at the end of the day, you know, things change really quickly on the
Absolutely,
water.
absolutely. And then of course, then the other tip would be to understand rip currents and how to get out of a rip current, right? So at most beachheads now, there's posted signs about getting out of a rip current, and basically the bottom line is I don't want to try to fight my way directly back to the beach against the rip current. I want to swim parallel the beach with the current, or the sweep as we call it, until I'm outside of the rip current, and then I can swim diagonally back to the beach. So I'm not going to end up in the spot that I left the beach from, but I'm still going to end up on the beach. And if I try to fight the rip current, even an Olympic swimmer may or may not be able to successfully fight the rip current.
Yeah, I love the break the grip of the rip, I think
Break
is
the
what
grip of
they
the rip,
say.
that's right, yes.
And even in East Hampton, you guys hand them out at the beaches, which we're trying to do that with Southampton as well, because I think those little pamphlets, they're at Main Beach, I think.
Yes, they have them at Main Beach, yes.
Yeah, it's really helpful to people.
Yep.
We have a couple of minutes for audience questions.
How many officers do you supervise, and how do you balance your winter work and your summer work?
Excellent question. So we have 4 full-time harbor masters, including myself, and then we have about another dozen part-time harbor masters that fill a crucial role and help us out in the summer during our busy season, so that I can have that sort of staffing level that I was looking for and talking about earlier, with somebody east, somebody west, somebody out on the boat. Without the part-timers, that would be extremely difficult to do. And luckily, we have a good core of part-timers that are available to work. The problem with part-timers, becomes that, if it's your side job or your second job, and I ask you to work the, 4 p.m. to 2 a.m. tour, you may or may not want to do that, and I can't really make you if you're a part-timer, right? So that's one of the ways that we balance it. So what happens is, in the summer season, then I have that large staff, but then in the winter, some of those individuals still work part-time hours, but not as many. All of them are required to actually go back to work less than 20 hours per week. So then that leaves just about the right amount of work for the remaining staff. And also in the winter, believe it or not, our season, we stay fairly busy, through the opener of scallop season, into November, and then there's fishing season. People are getting striped bass. That keeps us busy, until that ends. So then the slow months are December, January, February, March. Then it starts picking back up in April. We generally use that time to do, maintenance on our boats, maintenance on the buoys, maintenance on the different equipment, training. We do a lot of training. We do on the Marine Patrol all the same training that all the police officers do in the police department. So we do that on a regular basis. So that works out well. Yeah, and I'm very lucky that I have a very good staff currently.
In Gardner's Bay, you will see along the shoreline netted fishing weirs, right? Fish traps.
Yeah.
Are those, and they're commercial, are those regulated in any way? And
They are.
Is the placement of them regulated?
They are. They're regulated, and those commercial fishermen need to get a permit from the clerk's office for their pound traps, which is what we're talking about, right? And they are regulated and permitted. Yes, and we generally have very little problems with that. We have more problems with the commercial fishermen complaining that people are pulling up to their traps on paddle boards and stuff and trying to take fish out of the bunt, which is the end of the trap, right? The fish comes, hits the trap, swims out, and then it gets stuck out at the end. And so in that little corral there, that's where people go. And then sometimes we get other sea life, seals and stuff hanging out in the fish trap.
Is there a season for them?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's generally April to kind of like November, like the general fishing season. So they get different species in their traps. You know, there's different, you know, so there's certain time periods where they, I mean, they basically check their traps regularly, but there's certain times a year where there's enough fish that they have to haul the fish out of the traps more often than other times of the year. I mean, it's not consistent, is what I'm saying. It depends on what fish are running at any given time. Yeah.
And are the seals, they get stuck, or they're trying to find a free lunch?
They're trying to find a free lunch, and sometimes they get stuck. One issue we have is we get over 100 seal calls a year, you know, from seals on the beach, and generally, you know, 95% of those seals, right, are fine, and they're just taking a break and they're sunbathing on the beach. The biggest problem we have is the general public thinks there's something wrong with that seal, and they want to try to get that seal in the water, and they want to touch that seal, and it's a federally protected mammal, and they shouldn't go near the seal. The best thing for the seal is to give it a lot of space. I'm throwing a PSA in here. You see,
Yeah.
is to give the seal a lot of space, and you can call the you know, New York Marine Rescue people, and it's good that they know that the seal is there, which is good, but they generally don't need to intervene. I mean, if you see a seal that's very active and it's moving around on the beach and doing what I call seal yoga and stretching, that seal's probably fine. If you see a seal though that's very that you get close to and it doesn't even react to your presence, it's unreactive seal, that could be a problem. Sorry, I digressed. I don't know, that wasn't anything like your question, but yeah. Okay.
Okay, yes.
Time for one more?
Yes, one more question.
You know, Tim, you know, being on the water, and you said something earlier about getting to know a lot of these skilled fishermen on the hull seining boats and stuff.
Yes.
In your time working on the waters here in East Hampton, how many of these local traditional baymen are still working the waters of East Hampton? I know they're declining, they're moving away, do you have a rough estimate of how many local baymen?
This is not a scientific estimate. Off the top of my head, probably a third of the amount that, you know, were here in the 80s, 90s, getting into 2000 when you know, I mean, it all started with the moratorium on striped bass and the actual prohibition on hull seining. Right now you can gill net, but you can't hull seine. Right, the difference being that the gill net will only hold a certain size species, whereas the hull seine would take, you know, whatever was there, and then just the depletion of a lot of the resources, whether it be fish or shellfish, obviously. And then of course you have probably even the biggest problem is these individuals, if they can sell their house now, right, for, you know, a couple $1 million, you can move somewhere and live like a king, right? So you're gonna, I mean, what are you gonna do? I mean, it's a real problem. Yeah.
We do have time for one more if anyone.
Just quickly, are there any marine sanctuaries in the town of East Hampton that are like untouchable bottomlands for, you know, conservation purposes? And if there are, how are they doing?
There are no year-round marine sanctuaries. They did have the Shellfish did establish marine sanctuaries, like in Nap Peak Harbor. There was a sanctuary for the Scallops, which unfortunately one year got pillaged. But there's no other than uncertified areas, right? You know, there's no actual sanctuary where nothing can be touched or protected like that, like a coral reef type of sanctuary. There's nothing like that I know of yet.
Has that ever been floated to do something like that in specific areas?
Not that I know of. I think that probably, you know, it depends where that area would be and what people would perceive as the impact on that, right? I mean, you have, like, there's a large percentage of the population, for instance, that's anti-beach driving, right? But then there's also a very large percentage of the population that wants to retain the right to be able to drive on the beach. So that's sort of where you run into the problem is, you know, the two different factors, and then sort of the town board's stuck in the middle, in between, in between both of those groups.
I have to say, if we had another hour, I would have asked you about beach driving, because I feel like you have some good.
Yeah, well, that's a hot topic right
Stories,
now, so
yeah.
I guess I'm glad we're out of town, out of time, yeah.
Well, thank you so much
Oh,
for
it's been
coming.
my pleasure, Alex, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And this was South Fork Sea Farmers. Thank you.
thank you.